Morning, folks. Welcome to the Daily Politics. The government's under fire about its tax deal with Google. The US search engine giant has agreed to pay £130 million in back tax and interest, which sounds a lot, but perhaps isn't when you consider Google books several billion pounds in British revenues every year. And Italy could be about to strike a much tougher deal, even though Google Italy is much smaller than Google UK.
You won't need a search engine to find out who'll be starring at today's PMQs. Call Me Dave and Jezza face each other across the dispatch box at midday.
Campaigners want to lower the age you can vote to 16, but not everyone's behind the move. We'll be talking to one political expert who thinks it should be raised to the ripe old age of 25. But why should Joko be deprived of the vote?
Good point. And have you booked your summer holiday yet? If not, how about a Brexit break to Brussels? Believe it or not, there's a new holiday range for the political junkie. We can't believe it either.
That's the kind of thing we'd probably go on, isn't it?
We'll be the first ones there.
We will be. And the only ones.
Yeah, the only ones.
Anyway, all that's coming up in the next hour and a half. And with us for the duration, Arts Minister Ed Vaizey. We have to be nice to him because otherwise he could be horrible to us. His department sort of oversees the BBC.
The power.
He is, in fact, the longest-serving Arts Minister ever. So he must be very good at it, or nobody else could be bothered. Probably the latter. With us also... Just blowing it, haven't I? With us also the Shadow Women's and Equalities Minister, Kate Green. We have to be nice to her, otherwise it just wouldn't be fair. Kate's one of 3 Shadow Women and Equalities Ministers on the Labour front bench, but to us, she's first among equals. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Now, since we have a culture minister with us, let's talk about the TV licence fee and the over 75s, because the BBC is exploring plans to persuade pensioners who currently don't pay the licence fee to opt into it. Is that a good idea?
Well, I mean, it's up to the BBC, who are now responsible for the free TV licence fee. I got an email from a constituent this morning who said they would willingly pay the over 75s licence fee. They are over 75, obviously, and I've had conversations with other pensioners, people over the age of 75, who said they wouldn't. But I think it's perfectly within the BBC's rights. Now it's responsible for the free television licence to ask people if they want to make a voluntary contribution.
And you'd be comfortable with that idea, and with a campaign that's been talked about, fronted by celebrities, to persuade pensioners over 75 to pay for their own TV licences?
As I say, I mean, the BBC is now responsible for it. We reached agreement with them that they would take on the free television licence, and if they want to ask people to make a voluntary contribution, that's entirely a matter.
Are you worried that your postbag will become full of complaints from pensioners who feel they're being put under pressure here?
No, I don't. That didn't occur to me. As I say, I think I get a lot of emails from my constituents about the BBC. People care passionately about the BBC's future. They want to have a say in it. We've had the second largest consultation we've ever had as a government on the future of the BBC, and I imagine this will be part of that debate.
Yes, they care about it, and many of them, I suspect, were unhappy with a decision that really was palming off a difficult welfare decision for the government and putting it onto the BBC.
Well, I think it's right the BBC, as it were, has wholesale responsibility for its financing, and part of the is free television licences for
Why didn't you make that
pensioners,
decision? Why didn't the government make that decision about over 75?
Well, we reached an agreement with the BBC that they would take on responsibility for it, and we also said to them that they were free, as it were, to remove that after the 5-year period which we guaranteed in our manifesto, and they're also free, as they're doing now, to engage with people over the age of 75 and say, would you like to make a contribution to the BBC?
But it's the government that's accountable to voters, isn't it? You are the ones that should make those sorts of decisions.
The BBC is accountable to Parliament, so it's accountable to voters through Parliament, but it's also accountable to people through the payment of the licence fee. People have to pay their licence fee, and therefore the BBC has a direct relation with the licence fees. And it's very important to say that the BBC is independent. I mean, Andrew quipped that somehow I have some say over his future, but actually the BBC should be independent of government.
Well, it should be.
And one of the ways that goes is by the financing it through the licence fee rather than through, say, general taxation.
Well, which services then do you think the BBC should cut to fund this scheme when it comes online? It's to the tune of £600 million.
Well, again, I don't think ministers should tell the BBC what services to cut, which is a slightly sort of pejorative way of putting it.
But you made an agreement and a decision to voice this on the BBC.
I think the BBC has to look at all its services and decide which ones it wants to maintain and are most effective. It's made a recent decision, for example, to move BBC 3 from online, but part of the justification was that, say, more and more people are going online to view. Let's, as it were, get ahead of the curve, have a well-established brand that we move online, which is aimed at younger viewers, and learn lessons about how to engage with people online in terms of viewing content.
Kate, did you support that initial decision and agreement, as Ed Vaizey calls it, between the BBC and government for the BBC to actually fund the over-75s TV licence?
I think what's really important to recognise is that the BBC is a public service broadcaster, and so we've got to make sure that it's on a sustainable financial footing. And that's a government concern, a government responsibility, because we all rely on the BBC as independent and impartial and informative. As far as this initiative around the over-75s is concerned, I think we've got to be concerned. First of all, it may not raise very much money and may be quite bureaucratic to implement, so the gains may be very, very marginal. But I'd be particularly concerned, and this is my concern, about the transferring of the funding onto the BBC, and therefore they've got to find that money somewhere. If this starts to exclude already very marginalised pensioners, many of them find the television an absolute lifeline. They can't get out of the house. They need the BBC. We really need to be very careful about the impact of these kind of changes.
It would be voluntary. Certainly it seems at the moment. A campaign by celebrities, though, to persuade pensioners, do you think that would be seen by some as bullying almost?
I hope it wouldn't be seen as bullying, and I hope nobody will feel offended when I say that some pensioners, though, could be confused. They may not get the message clearly. They may not understand that it is a voluntary option, that they don't have to go out and make a contribution. So I am concerned. I understand why the BBC are looking at every single possibility to raise money, but I do think that this could impact very harshly on some vulnerable people.
What about other pensioner benefits? Because certainly in the run-up to the election, Labour were looking, or certainly said they would be reviewing pensioner benefits that were given right across the board. Should that be looked at again?
If I'm honest, we were really miserable about pensioners before the election. What we talked about wasn't very joyful. It wasn't about the enjoyment of your retirement, about, you know, a happy and fulfilling lifestyle. And I think what we've got to remember is pensioners span a very wide age range now. You know, women and men in their 60s and 70s are living a very different kind of life from those in their 80s and 90s.
Should well-off pensioners still get those benefits?
So I think it is really important that we do review across the piece the way in which benefits are structured for older people, how they can support those older people who want to carry on working through their 60s and 70s, and many do, to gain from employment, but also to be sure that they've got a secure income for their retirement. And I think we've got to make sure that those who are finding it most difficult to save for retirement, women, those in low-paid work, are properly protected. Of a full review. We're 4.5 years away from a general election.
Fine.
Let's use that time to get it right.
Thank you.
Now it's coming up to the end of January, and the spectre of the looming tax return is weighing heavily upon many. Working out tax is such a tiresome affair. I usually leave it to my butler. It's happy days, however, for Google, who've come to a deal with Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs to pay £130 million. It's backdated. But not everybody's happy. No. Let's talk now to our political correspondent, Vicky Young. She's in Central Lobby. Vicky, the Chancellor began by hailing this deal as, quote, a major success. It now looks like the government's a bit on the back foot, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think what we'll probably see today during Prime Minister's questions, if Jeremy Corbyn decides to tackle the Prime Minister on all of this, I think he'll be desperate to try and get David Cameron to repeat that phrase. Is it a major success? Do they still believe that it is? What they're clearly trying to do, Labour here, is to pin this on ministers. They are saying there should be no such thing as mates rates for these big companies. They're asking all sorts of questions, Labour, about what meetings Mr Osborne and Mr Cameron may have had with people from Google. How much did they know about all of this? Of course, the bottom line here is we don't. It's HMRC, it's the tax authorities who deal with all of this. It is by its nature secret, so very hard for people to establish exactly what rate Google might be paying and how they came to this deal in the first place.
Well, the politicians may shout about it, perhaps even on both sides of the House, but isn't it the case that this is a done deal? HMRC has agreed with Google, that's it. They've probably signed a clause that it can't be reopened unless it was found that Google had some way broken the law, involved in illegal activity. It is 130 million, job done.
That's right, and we've heard from people like Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, who, although saying it's not very much money, pointing out that actually they have done nothing wrong and actually it's the law probably that needs to change. Now, George Osborne would say, look, he has brought in a new tax on diverted profits, for example. He is trying to tackle all of this. Of course, what would look bad would be if Italy, France, as has been suggested, that they somehow try and get more money and do get more money out of Google. That would then make the HMRC here look pretty bad. But it's the corporation tax, it's the system that the UK has. The Treasury Select Committee has said it's going to look into all of that. The chairman of that committee is saying that the UK tax laws are too elastic.
All right, Vicky, thank you very much for that. Ed Vaizey, the Chancellor, described this as a major success. Boris Johnson said the money was derisory. Who's right?
Well, I think what is right is that HMRC conducted a 6-year audit with Google and secured back taxes dating back to 2005. That the HMRC has said are the right taxes that Google should pay as a back tax. And I think what is right is that the Chancellor's introduced the diverted profit tax that Vicky referred to, which means that going forward, Google will pay tax on the profits it generates in the UK in a proper way. And in fact, the diverted profits tax is something that other countries around the world have started to copy. And also, the point about France and Italy is well made in the sense that there's not a single country, a developed country, that's not wrestling with these digital companies that have, as it were, a global presence. And the UK has taken the lead in the OECD in saying we have to sort this out on an international level as well.
But isn't it right that under this deal, up until now, Google will not pay the diverted profits tax?
No, the diverted profits tax has just come in. So
it's for the future.
Yeah. So this tax year, I think, is the first year that Google will pay the diverted profits.
So it's not any profits that they think have been diverted have now been covered by this deal.
So it's going forward, it will pay it, and under this audit by HMRC, we've seen 10 years of back tax being paid, so that's good.
Is it all back tax, or is it interest as well? Are there penalties?
Well, I mean, I think what you're getting at, this is a confidential agreement in the sense that companies do reach agreements with HMRC about the right level of tax that they should pay, and they probably reached it on the basis that they're some of the basis of that for commercial reasons.
Included interest and penalties, the amount of actual tax wouldn't be that huge. It would be less than 130 million.
Well, you can argue the granular point, but the point is that the HMRC has gone through a very...
I'm arguing it wouldn't. It would be
a very
if it includes penalties and interest.
Everyone will have a view on what Google should pay fairly. What
is it a major success?
What I would say is that the process is right. It shouldn't be for ministers to say
I understand that. I'm not...
what a company should pay. It should be HMRC conducting an audit,
of course,
going through the books and reaching an agreement with Google. And as you know, when you reach an agreement like that, there may be issues to do with interest and penalties, and there will also be calculations about if this, for example, came to court and the expense and time involved in that. So there will be all sorts of issues. That
I understand all that, but would it be a major success if it turns out, as is being reported, that France and Italy, where Google is much smaller, it's a quarter of what it is here in France, ended up getting a lot more money out of them?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on what France and Italy might agree. People are already talking as though the Italians have secured a fantastic settlement.
No, they haven't, but they seem quite far down the road.
What I think is a success is that we have this agreement with Google to pay these back taxes. We have a diverted profits tax that the other countries around the world are now copying, and we have the UK in the lead in terms of international forums saying that we need changes to international tax laws to cope with digital companies that are able to move quite freely around the globe. You say it's a success,
but in 2014, Google's revenues out of the UK were almost £5 billion, and it is not covered by the deal, this is separate from the deal, and it paid 30 million in corporation tax. Let me give you the figures again. 5 billion in revenues, 30 million in corporation tax. Is that a success?
Well, those who've been watching the news in the lead up to this programme will have seen the head of investigations at HMRC explaining that some of the calculations that are made effectively to criticise this settlement are not based on an accurate understanding of tax law. Tax law is complicated. International tax law is even more complicated. Right. I'm simply saying that I am confident that HMRC went through a very thorough process.
But is it
and it's
fair?
Right that is an independent process.
I'm not sure that it's actually done 2014 yet. Is it fair that a company that makes revenues of almost 5 billion in Britain pays only 30 million in corporation tax?
We want companies to pay their fair share of tax. That's why the Chancellor introduced the diverted profits tax. He addressed that, and he was actually criticised in some international forums for saying, actually, you're messing with international tax treaties.
Yeah.
But he went ahead with it because he thinks it's the right thing to do, and that has now been copied by other countries around the world. Google will pay, I think, its fair share of tax going forward. And also, we are in the lead in international forums in saying
Well,
this
you
is
may
an
be in the lead,
international
but
issue,
out of revenues of
working with other
$5
countries,
billion,
and
well,
we
you've made
need
that
to do
point 3 times. Let me make another point again. Out of $5 billion, the Exchequer, is that fair?
But you know what the issue is. The issue is that Google's European headquarters are based in Ireland with a low level of corporation tax. The same argument is raised in Australia, where Google's says its Asian headquarters are based in Singapore, and that's where it should pay its tax. So Google's argument, I mean, we are getting into lots of detail of which, you know,
Yeah, but it's
I am not
important because
privy
this is
to,
money that pays for our
but
schools
we know that Google
and hospitals. So, well, let me ask you
Google's
this.
position in terms of its negotiations is European headquarters.
Well, let me ask you this. Has this agreement with HMRC now, has it established that Google now has a permanent establishment in Britain?
Well, that's a very technical point, and that was presumably that is part of the debate about whether Google is paying its fair share of tax.
Does it or doesn't it have a permanent establishment in
You can
Britain?
ask the HMRC that, on what basis it is both.
Well, you visited the headquarters. I think we've got a picture of the headquarters. That's the new headquarters, because their existing one isn't big enough. This is the proposed headquarters up in King's Cross, 5,000 people. You are the one they've got at the moment. It's split between 2 sites. I think you went last week. They employ over 1,000 people. Is it not incredible that anybody that is planning to build a bigger headquarters like that cannot, for tax purposes, have a permanent establishment in Britain?
Well, I went to visit what is known as the Google campus because I was supporting an organisation called Creative.
Did it look permanent to you?
Which supports.
I mean, was it a pop-up headquarters? Was it a pop-up headquarters, or did it? Does that look permanent to you?
An organisation called Creative England, which does a hell of a lot of work supporting our fantastically successful creative industries all around the UK. But you're asking me a technical point, as I say.
Well, that's not technical.
It doesn't look that technical. It looks like a massive headquarters.
HMRC has conducted an extensive audit. It's come
Will
to
they
a
still
settlement
be
with Google.
sending? Will
we
they
have
still
a new
be
tax regime, which was controversial with some of these digital companies. It was controversial in some international forums, but the Chancellor went ahead with it because he recognises what the public want to see, which is companies like this paying the tax.
But the question is whether this is enough. And let me come to Labour, because the fact is that since 2005, Google has been following the principles of how you measure taxable profits that it agreed with the last Labour government. So if Google's not paying enough tax, it's as much Labour's fault as the Tories.
As I understand it, the first questions began to be asked in 2009. And of course, Margaret Hodge, Labour chair of the Public Accounts Committee in the last Parliament, really took up the mantle of this
but she's
campaign.
not in government.
She wasn't in government.
The principles that Google followed in paying tax were agreed with the last Labour government.
And time
if
has
it's
gone
underpaying
on.
tax, you made the wrong agreement.
And time has gone on. A lot of time has gone on, if I may say so, Andrew, since 2009. And while I welcome steps to toughen up and agree internationally a more robust tax regime, I think we've got to recognise that circumstances and learning and understanding of Google's operations, it was a pretty new company in the mid-2000s.
Did you make a mistake in agreeing to such a lax tax regime?
I have no idea, Andrew, about whether that tax regime was appropriate for companies like Google, was appropriate for other companies, or at the time, what I think we can all agree on is it's not appropriate.
Well, hold on. It was a tax regime agreed by the last Labour government that allowed Facebook, a multi-billion-dollar corporation with massive business in Britain, to pay corporation tax of £4,000 in 2011.
It's derisory, isn't it? Nobody could defend that.
By a system agreed by your government.
And what's really important, having obviously set up a tax regime that hadn't understood at the time the way in which some of these international online, really without much in the way of material substance companies, I think we didn't, perhaps any of us, accountants, tax people, the Treasury, governments, didn't understand, and perhaps the companies themselves didn't fully, how their operations would knit to the tax regime that we'd had for many years. What I think is really important now is that there's credibility in our tax system. And I have to say, as a taxpayer, you will feel as a taxpayer, my constituents who are taxpayers feel that this is really pretty insulting. We pay our taxes. Our small businesses pay taxes. Family companies pay their taxes. They look at this and they think this is a deal for the rich and not.
Differently then.
I think we, first of all, need to be much, much sharper about keeping expert HMRC staff who can negotiate the right deals. Ed's pointing out we don't have any information.
HMRC uses its top experts in dealing with
Well,
Google.
perhaps it needs to invest more in the expertise that it
think
has.
that would
We've
make a
lost
difference?
substantial numbers of experts in HMRC,
All
and we
right.
don't have any
Not in
transparency.
the office that deals with
and we
Google.
don't have any
Can you-
transparency. You know, this is something that the government is hotly defending, the privacy of Google's tax affairs, but that has to be balanced with public belief in the system, and that's just missing.
You allowed a double Irish and a Dutch sandwich. That's what Google were able to do. Can you still do that?
No, I think we got rid of the double Irish, but I would go back
we
to.
might still
I
have the
would
Dutch
go back
sandwich.
to your. I don't know if we have the Dutch sandwich. I was told the other day that the human brain can accommodate 4.7 billion books, but I can't accommodate whether we've got the double Dutch sandwich. But I
right.
do think that we have raised £100 billion in taxes, back taxes, including £38 billion from back
Right.
taxes from big corporations,
Okay.
thanks to the experts in HMRC.
Well, from double Dutch to the so-called bedroom tax, which has been declared discriminatory by Court of Appeal judges following a legal challenge by a domestic violence victim and the family of a disabled teenager. They had argued that the spare room subsidy, which reduces for social housing tenants with a spare bedroom, is discriminatory. The government says it's to appeal against the decision. Do you back the government's decision to appeal this?
Yes, I obviously do. As a member of the government, I would back the government's decision to
Just checking.
appeal it. I haven't seen the judgment,
Why?
so I don't know on what basis the judgment was made and how it was found to be discriminatory. But clearly, Ian Duncan-Smith and his team and the government as a whole doesn't agree with this judgment. It's perfectly within its rights to appeal it.
But why? I mean, we're talking about two small but very vulnerable groups of people, disabled children who need an overnight carer, so they need a room to stay in, and victims of serious domestic violence who need a safe sanctuary. Talking about thousands in the former, 300 with the latter. There couldn't be an exception made for those two groups of people?
Well, there are a range of exceptions, as you know, in terms of the spare room subsidies. So
But
there
not
are
for those two
exceptions for
groups of
elder
people.
people. There
No,
are,
but I'm
there
talking
are-
about
there
these
are-
two,
there are
Daisy.
there are exceptions for people with disabilities and their carers, and there are exceptions for vulnerable children as well. So
Sorry, there isn't an
there
exemption
are a
for...
range.
Hang on, let's be clear, because there isn't an exemption for disabled children who need an overnight carer. They've just won that court battle, and you're saying it's still fair to make them pay
Well, as
or
I
have
say,
their housing benefit
I haven't
reduced?
seen the details of the judgment. I don't know on what basis this was taken to court, and I don't know on what basis the Court of Appeal has made its judgment that come out
Well,
in areas
it's
where
very
I'm
straightforward.
responsible.
I've
Often
just told you what the-
when
what
you
the-
read the judgment, which will probably be a 50 or 100-page judgment, there will be a lot of detail in there. There may be issues to do with the process in terms of how it was introduced, which the government may have to look at. But clearly, the government has made a very firm statement very early on that it doesn't agree with this judgment. It wants to appeal it, and it clearly thinks it has grounds to appeal.
How do you think it looks, though, to the public when the government says it wants to protect the most vulnerable in society, and people would judge that these two groups are amongst the most vulnerable in society, and yet they cannot be exempted from this paying of a spare room subsidy or a bedroom tax, whatever you want to call it, because the government thinks it has to fit into its broad range of welfare plans?
Well, what the government is doing, which I think does have overwhelming public support, is to reform welfare.
Sure,
We've seen
but that
public
wasn't what I
support
asked,
for
was it?
welfare in terms of capping, for example, the amount of benefits that people get. And I think there is support for the spare room subsidy when you consider
For
there
these
are
two
a
groups of
quarter of a
people.
million families living in overcrowded accommodation. There are something like 400,000 homes that are under-occupied. So we want to have a system, and people have looked at under-occupancy for many, many years. We want a system that encourages people who are under-occupying their house to look for alternative accommodation. We want to get people in crowded housing into appropriate accommodation.
All right.
I can't comment on the specific details of the court case. I haven't seen the judgment. I do know the government is appealing it, and I'm assuming they're doing it because they think they're right to appeal it.
We'll leave it there.
Now, the Justice Secretary, he's called Michael Gove, told the House of Commons yesterday that, contrary to reports, he's not become, and I quote, a sandal-wearing, muesli-munching vegan vegster. Or could that be Vogster? I think it should be Vogster, not Vegster.
I'm not sure, actually.
I'm a bit vague on that. Anyway, I'm glad he felt the need to clear it up. I don't really think it was necessary, Mr. Gove. He was responding to a question from a Conservative backbencher called Philip Davis, who's certainly none of the above, a man, indeed, who I think it's fair to say is not known for wearing sandals or for munching muesli. But here at the Daily Politics, it got us thinking, what's wrong with sandals? or muesli. We don't care if you've swapped your shiny brogues for an altogether more comfortable shoe, or if you've ditched the full English for a healthier alternative, or indeed if you've swapped your fully caffeinated beverage for the green leaf variety. We believe that it's not what you drink, it's how you drink it. And what better way to sip your organic dandelion tea than from one of these, a Daily Politics mug. But whether you're vegan or not, you'll have to enter Guess the Year competition to get your hands on one.
Gosh, that was a long time to get to that, wasn't it? Anyway, we'll remind you how to enter in just a minute. But first, do you know when this happened?
So far, 11 MPs, both Labour and Tory, have stood down or been forced out because of the expenses saga.
Like him don't shine so bright. Soon as I see the dust settle, he's out on the town trying to find trouble.
Indigenous British, the people who've been here.
The whites.
That's it. The skin colour's irrelevant, Jack.
We weren't born to follow. Come on and get up off your knees. When life is a pill to swallow, you gotta hold on to what you believe. Anything that's what heaven is sure enough worth fighting for. Quitting's out of the question.
And we can change things. Iogo Collins!
We gotta fight, 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 fight for this love. We gotta fight, 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 fight for this love. We gotta fight, 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 fight.
This is live.
And to be in with a chance of winning a Daily Politics mug, send your answer to our special quiz email address. That's dbquiz@bbc.co.uk. Entries must arrive by 12:30 today. And you can see the full terms and conditions for Guess the Year on our website. That's bbc.co.uk/Daily Politics. Andrew.
Coming up to midday here, there's Big Ben behind me, as always. Almost 12 o'clock. Prime Minister's questions on its way. Laura Kuenssberg already in the studio with us. Laura, what's likely to dominate the front bench exchanges today?
Well, I think there's a nice big parcel of a gift that George Osborne tied up with a big fat ribbon at the end of Davos, especially for John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn to open up Prime Minister's questions today. This deal with Google, which he tried to claim as a major victory. Of course, it was an HMRC deal, but by George Osborne claiming it as a victory, he put himself in the story. And then, of course, over the coming days, as politicians in all parties and the public sort of looked a bit more closely at the scale of the deal, those $5 billion in revenues and then 130 million quid in back taxes, it's a bit of a question about the smell test. And I think it's inevitable that Labour will raise that today, because I think they really think they're onto something here. They're going to push it and push it again as a campaign. And I understand later today a letter is going to go to the government calling on the National Audit Office to investigate.
All right. Europe. Increasingly moving up the agenda. What do you hear on the latest? The government hopes for the timetable to get it in by the end of June.
Indeed.
But might not.
The 23rd of June is the date to pencil into your diaries for those who
I've done that.
Sad enough like me and you to do that. And for
But
the
I have
rest
an
of-
eraser ready to move it.
And it would be wise to have an eraser ready to take it out. The stumbling block, as we've known for some time in these negotiations, is the question of getting an agreement that looks anything like the Prime Minister's promise to ban benefits for EU workers in the UK for 4 years. In the other parts of the renegotiation, there's sort of a way through, no final agreements, but it seems there's a way through. Sherpa's officials this week are frantically beetling backwards and forwards between Brussels and London trying to find a way through on welfare. If that can be done, and there is a belief in government that it can indeed be done, because no one wants to talk about this around the EU for a moment longer than is absolutely
Because they've got bigger
necessary.
fish to fry.
They've got bigger fish to fry. And there's also no guarantee that if you just keep going and going on and on and on around the same territory, that you end up with a better agreement anyway. So it's possible, the government is hopeful, but they've been very careful in the last 7 days or so to sort of row back a bit from what at the beginning of the year was probably overconfidence and public overconfidence. You know, even the Chancellor saying things like, oh, it's all falling into place.
But they'll still need to get the date through Parliament. And if Labour was to vote against June, and Mrs Sturgeon's already indicated the Scottish Nationalists don't want the end of June, and a number of Tory Eurosceptics peeled off because they believe the longer they wait for the referendum, the better their chance of winning. They might not get it through for June.
Well, this sounds like all of us obsessing about ridiculous process, but it matters enormously. And there's a lot of chatter about this in the corridors of the House of Commons at the moment. If Labour, and this is the real question, if they could be persuaded or see it in their interest to give the government maximum embarrassment on this, to go alongside with the Scott Nats, and indeed we've seen also there's concern in Northern Ireland and Wales also about this timetable,
Because the
important
elections are taking
elections there
place.
too. If be persuaded that it would be fun and larks to embarrass the government on the timetable, they could easily do it.
Will Labour vote for the end of June as a referendum date?
What I can say, Andrew, from talking to companies in my constituency is that the longer we're in an uncertain situation, the worse that is for the UK economy.
So you would rather
So I
have it
don't think it's
sooner?
about fun and games and playing politics. I think it's about what's in the interest of the country, and that's what we will have to discuss.
All right.
First of all, I want to see what the deal is that the Prime Minister comes back with.
But you would have a preference for sooner rather than later?
I certainly think a protracted campaign is bad for the UK and bad for business.
And I think that is the view amongst the majority of the PLP, and I think Alan Johnson, who's leading the Labour campaign, would be very unhappy
Well, in
about
that
any
case-
attempt to...
In that case, the Eurosceptics and the Scott Nats don't have sway.
It looks unlikely, but there are people sort of nibbling around the edges of this.
All right. We've got the ballot paper. We can put it up on the screen.
Ah.
The ballot paper. This
Yes.
is what we'll get to vote whenever the date is. And I've got one for Ed Vasey,
Public service.
Well, Ed, fill it in now.
one for you
Thank you.
there, and fill it in.
Oh, the deal hasn't come back.
Would you like to fill it in? Being on the Daily Politics is like a secret ballot anyway. Nobody will see it.
Won't tell a soul.
There we go. So that's Remain.
There you go.
There we go, the first Remain. Ed, what have you
It's
voted?
okay, you're not going to wait for the deal to come back then. You
There
know
you
what
go.
you're
What
going
have
to
you
Labour
voted?
believes we should stay in the European
There we
Union.
go. Ed has voted Remain as well.
There we are.
That is because of my unswerving confidence in the Prime Minister. Deal he's going to bring back from
Who
Brussels.
said you were following the party line?
He said recovery.
Who said he wanted a promotion?
Interesting, because for a long time, David Cameron always wanted to maintain publicly. There was still an iota of a chance that he might change his mind suddenly at the last minute if he didn't get what he wanted. Can we really now believe that, given that day after day he's sounding more and more, or closer to saying...
But he can't wait to be able to come out and start campaigning to stay in, can he?
He's sort of, you can almost see he's sort of straining at it. He just wants to get on with it.
Has the
And he
idea-
will take a very personal, forward, sort of leading role in the campaign. So I think while the other side is sort of under continued questioning about who they're going to have as the leader, if indeed there is one leader of the out campaign, I think it's clear now the leader of the in campaign will be the Prime Minister. And this is why there's that rather, again, what sounds like process, but is actually very important, this spat
Okay.
about the timing.
Okay.
The Cabinet after he comes
Let's
back
see
from
if Europe
Brussels.
comes up as well. We go straight over to the House of Commons for Prime Minister's questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know the whole House will want to join me in marking Holocaust Memorial Day. It is right that our whole country should stand together to remember the darkest hour of humanity. Last year, on the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, I said we would build a striking national memorial in London to show the importance Britain places on of the Holocaust. Today, I can tell the House this memorial will be built in Victoria Tower Gardens. It will stand beside Parliament as a permanent statement of our values as a nation, and will be something for our children to visit for generations to come. I'm grateful to all those who've made this possible and have given this work the cross-party status that it so profoundly deserves. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Peter Aldous.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I echo the Prime Minister's sentiments regarding Holocaust Memorial Day. We must never forget. The North Sea oil industry, North Sea oil and gas industry, on which many people in my Waveney constituency are dependent for their livelihoods, is facing very serious challenges at the current time. The government has taken steps to address the situation, but more is required if the industry is first to survive and then to thrive. Will my right honourable friend assure me that he recognises the seriousness of the situation and he will do all that he can to get the industry through these very difficult times?
No, well, my honourable friend is do recognise the seriousness of the situation. The oil price decline is the longest in 20 years and nearly the steepest, and this causes real difficulties for the North Sea, and we can see the effects in the east of England, of course across Scotland, particularly in Aberdeen, and in other parts of our country too. We discussed this at Cabinet yesterday. I'm determined that we build a bridge to the future for all those involved in the North Sea. We're going to help the sector export its world-class expertise. We're going to help the economies diversify. We've announced 1.3 billion of support last year for the North Sea. We're implementing the Wood Review. I'll be going to Aberdeen tomorrow, where we'll be saying more about what we can do to help this vital industry at this vital time.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the opposition, could I welcome the remarks the Prime Minister has just made about Holocaust Memorial Day. It's the 71st anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. We have to remember the deepest, darkest days of inhumanity that happened then and the genocides that have sadly happened since, and educate another generation to avoid those for all time in the future. I thank the Prime Minister for what he said. Mr. Speaker, independent experts have suggested that Google is paying an effective tax rate on its UK profits of around 3%. Does the Prime Minister dispute that figure?
Well, let's be clear what we're talking about here. We're talking about tax that should have been collected under a Labour government, raised by a Conservative government. That's what we're talking about. I do dispute the figures that he gives. It's quite rightly this is done independently by HMRC, but I'm absolutely clear that no government has done more than this one to crack down on tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance. No government, and certainly not the last Labour government.
Mr. Speaker, my question actually was if the Prime Minister thinks an effective tax rate of 3% is right or wrong. He didn't answer it. The Chancellor of the Exchequer described this arrangement as a major success, while the Prime Minister's official spokesperson only forward. The Mayor of London described the payment as quite derisory. What exactly is the government's position on this 3% rate of taxation?
But we have put in place the diverted profit tax that means that this company and other companies will pay more tax in future, and more tax in future than they ever paid under Labour, where the tax rate for Google was 0%. That is what we face. Let me tell him what we have done. We have changed the tax law so many times that we raised an extra 100 billion from business in the last Parliament. When I came to power, banks didn't pay tax on all their profits, allowed under Labour, stopped under the Tories. Investment companies could cut their tax bill by flipping the currency under Labour, stopped under the Tories. Companies could fiddle accounting rules to make losses appear out of thin air, allowed under Labour, stopped under the Tories. We've done more on tax evasion and tax avoidance than Labour ever did. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, they're running to catch up, but they haven't got a leg to stand on.
Mr. Speaker, it was under a Labour government that the inquiries were begun into Google, and in addition, as a percentage of GDP, corporation tax receipts are lower under this government than they were under previous governments. I've got a question here, Mr. Speaker, from a gentleman called Jeff. Now, you might well laugh, but Jeff speaks for millions of people when he says to me, can you ask the Prime Minister if, as a working man of over 30 years, whether there is a scheme which I can join that pays the same rate of tax as Google and other large corporations? What does the Prime Minister say to Jeff?
Well, what I say to Jeff is that his taxes are coming down under this government and Google's taxes are going up under this government. Let me say, Let me say to the right honourable gentleman, something he just said in his last question was factually inaccurate. He said corporation tax receipts have gone down. They've actually gone up by 20% under this government because we've got a strong economy with businesses making money, employing people, investing in our country and paying taxes into the exchequer. And let me say to him, if, like me, he's genuinely angry about what happened to Google under Labour, can I tell him a few people he could call? Maybe he should start by calling Tony Blair. You can get him at JP Morgan. Call Gordon Brown. Californian bond dealer called PIMCO. He could call Alistair Darling. I think he's at Morgan Stanley, but it's hard to keep up. Those are the people to blame for Google not paying their taxes. We're the ones who got them to pay.
The problem is, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister, is responsible to government, and therefore is responsible for tax collection. Mr. Speaker, Google made profits of £6 billion in the UK between 2005 and 2015, and is paying £130 billion in tax for the whole of that decade. Millions of people this week are filling in their tax returns to get them in by the 31st. They have to send the form back. They do not get the option of 25 meetings with 17 ministers to decide what their rate of tax is. Many people going to their HMRC offices or returning them online this week will say this: why is there one rule for big multinational companies and another for ordinary small businesses and self-employed workers?
All those people filling in their tax returns are going to be paying lower taxes under this government. That is what's happening. And I have to say to him, he can, if he wants, criticise HMRC, but HMRC's work is investigated by the National Audit Office, and when they did that, they found that the settlements that they've reached with companies are fair. That is how it works. Now, the Shadow Chancellor's pointing. The Shadow Chancellor, the idea that those two right honourable gentlemen would stand up to anyone in this regard is laughable. Look at the record over the last week. They met with the unions and they gave them flying pickets. They met with the Argentinians, they gave them the Falkland Islands. They met with a bunch of migrants in Calais, they said they could all come to Britain. The only people they never stand up for are the British people and hard-working taxpayers.
Mr. Speaker, we've had no answers on Google. We've had no answers on Jeff. Can I raise with him another unfair tax policy that does affect many people in this country? This morning, the Court of Appeal ruled that the bedroom tax is discriminatory because of its impact. I don't know why members opposite find this funny, because it isn't for those that have to pay it. And the ruling is because it is its impact on vulnerable individuals, including victims of domestic violence and disabled children. Will the Prime Minister now read the judgment and finally abandon this cruel and unjust policy, which has now been ruled to be illegal?
Well, we always look very carefully at the judgments on these occasions, but of course our fundamental position is that it's unfair to subsidise spare rooms in if you don't subsidise them in the private sector where people are paying a housing benefit. And that is a basic issue of fairness. But isn't it interesting that the first pledge he makes is something that could cost as much as £2.5 billion in the next Parliament? Who's going to pay for that? Well, Jeff will pay for it. The people filling in their tax returns will pay for it. Why is it that he always wants to see more welfare, higher taxes, more borrowing, all the things that got us into the mess in the first place?
Mr. Speaker, we haven't had any answers on Google or the bedroom tax, but I ask the Prime Minister this. Shortly before coming into the chamber, I became aware of the final report of the United Nations panel of experts on Yemen, which has been sent to the government, and it makes very disturbing reading. And I quote, it says, and this is the report, that it has documented that coalition forces have conducted airstrikes targeting civilians and civilian objects in violation of international humanitarian law, including camps for internally displaced persons and refugees, civilian residential areas, medical facilities, schools and mosques. These are very disturbing reports. In the light of this, will the Prime Minister agree to launch immediately an inquiry and a full review into the arms export licences to Saudi Arabia and suspend those arms sales until that review has been concluded?
Well, as the right honourable gentleman knows, we have the strictest rules for arms exports of almost any country anywhere in the world. And let me remind him, we are not a member of the Saudi-led coalition. We're not directly involved in the Saudi-led coalition's operations. British personnel are not involved in carrying out strikes. I will look at this report as I look at all other reports. But our arms exports are carefully controlled, and we are backing the legitimate government of the Yemen, not least because terrorist attacks planned in the Yemen would have a direct effect on people in our country. I refuse to run a foreign policy by press release, which is what he wants. I want a foreign policy that's in the interests of the British people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The recent explosion of spurious troops, including those pursued by the law firm that has donated tens of thousands of pounds to the shadow Defence Secretary, undermine the ability of our armed forces to do their job. Will the Prime Minister join me in repudiating the disdain this shows to our brave servicewomen and our brave servicemen?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. Of course, we hold our service personnel to the highest standards, and it's right that we do, but it's quite clear there's now an industry trying to profit from spurious claims that are lodged against our brave servicemen and women. And I'm determined to do everything we can to close this bogus industry down, and we should start by making clear that we will take action against any legal firm that we find to have abused the system to pursue fabricated claims. That is absolutely not acceptable.
Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I begin by associating the Scottish National Party with the comments of the Prime Minister in relation to Holocaust Memorial Day and commend governments across the United Kingdom for supporting the Holocaust Education Trust for the important work that they do. Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister agree that there is no justification for discrimination or unfairness towards women in the private sector, public sector or by government?
Well, first of all, let me welcome what the right honourable gentleman says about the Holocaust Education Trust. I remember as a new constituency MP meeting them and seeing the incredible work they were doing in my constituency, and they work extremely hard round the clock, but this day is particularly important for them. And I would urge colleagues who haven't visited Auschwitz, it is something you will never forget, no matter what you've read or films you've seen or books that you've interrogated. There is nothing like seeing for yourself what happened in the darkest hour of humanity. In terms of wanting to end discrimination against women in the public sector, in the private sector, in politics, in this place, yes, absolutely.
Mr. Angus Robertson.
I very much welcome what the Prime Minister has to say on both counts, and he's aware of the state pension inequality that is impacting on many women, and that this Parliament voted unanimously for the government to, and I quote, immediately introduce transitional arrangements for those women negatively affected by pension equalisation. What is the Prime Minister going to do to respect the decision of this Parliament, those women who are affected, those who were born in the 1950s, and should have had proper notice to plan their finances and their retirement?
Well, what I'd say to the honourable gentleman, first of all, the equalisation of the retirement age came about on the basis of equality, which was a judgment by the European Court that we put in place in the 1990s. When this government decided, rightly in my view, to raise the retirement age, we made the decision that no one should suffer a greater than 18-month increase in their retirement age, and that's the decision that this House of Commons took. In terms of ending discrimination in the pension system, I would say that the introduction of the single-tier pension at £155 a week will be one of the best ways we can end discrimination in the pension system, because so many women retiring will get so much more in their pension, which of course under this government is triple lock protected, so they'll get inflation earnings or 2.5% and never again the derisory 75p increase in the pension.
Charlotte Leslie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can still be centres of radicalisation. Will the Prime Minister look at all measures, including those in the all-party boxing report, of preventing young people, troubled young people, from falling into the jaws of these dangerously screwed-up predatory extremists?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. It is very disturbing that when people are in our care, when the state is looking after them, that on some occasions they have been radicalised because of what they've heard in prison, either from other prisoners or from perhaps even on occasions visiting imams. So we need to sort this situation out. The Justice Secretary has put in place a review. I'll look very carefully at the report that she says, but we must make sure that if anything, when people go to prison, if they're already radicalised, they're de-radicalised rather than made worse.
Margaret Ferrier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the Chancellor of the Exchequer took control of the public purse, he has utterly failed to get the deficit under, and to date this year has borrowed over £74 billion to plug the gap. Or to use the vernacular that his party is fond of using, for a hypothetical independent Scotland, a monumental financial black hole in his books. Is he now likely to breach their own deficit reduction target for the year by somewhere in the region of £9 billion? Will the Prime Minister finally concede? Will the Prime Minister...
Order. I don't wish to be unkind to the Honourable Lady, but I think we've got the gist. Order. That was a polite way of saying that the Honourable Lady had concluded her question. The Prime Minister.
What I would say is that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, and the economic strategy this government has pursued has cut the deficit in half from the record level that we inherited, and soon it will be down by 2/3, and we're meeting what we want to see in terms of debt falling as a share of our GDP. Now, what a contrast, I would say, with the situation that Scotland would be facing if Scotland had voted for independence in just 6 weeks' time. We've actually a collapse of 94% of the oil revenues. Now, because we've got the broad shoulders of the United Kingdom, that collapse in the oil price and the taxation won't affect people in Scotland. But had Scotland been independent, it would be a very, very dark day indeed.
Mr. Speaker. Recently I held a mental health forum in my constituency where I brought service users and commissioners together to explore how we could improve mental health services in Dudley and Sandwell. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's recent announcement on increased funding for mental health services? And would he agree with me that despite the fact that we have more work to do, that his commitments are a clear indication of our desire to have a revolution in mental health services in Britain, and he has delivered some commitments on that?
Well, I'm very grateful to what my honourable friend says. There is further to go, but this government is investing more in mental health. We've introduced the waiting times, most recently saying that young people suffering episodes of psychosis should be seen within 2 weeks. Parity of esteem, there's waiting time, but there also needs to be the bigger culture change, not just in the NHS, but right across the public sector and private sectors, so that mental health conditions are given the attention they deserve.
Thomas Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From this April, a woman who works full-time stands to lose thousands of pounds in tax credits if she becomes pregnant with her first child. When will this Prime Minister stop attacking working people?
What we're doing for women like that is making sure that this year they can earn £11,000 without paying any income tax. That if they're on low wages, if they're on the minimum wage, they'll get a 7% pay increase because of the national living wage. That for the first time there'll be 30 hours of free childcare for those people. That's what we're doing for hard-working people in our country. Do we need to reform welfare? Yes, we do. And if the honourable gentleman read the report into why his party lost the election, it's not the one they published, of course, the secret one we all read over the weekend, is by endlessly arguing for higher and higher welfare, the British public rightly conclude that under Labour there'd be higher and higher taxes.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's words on creating a national memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. Tonight in Harrow, representatives of the whole community will come together to listen to the people that survived the Holocaust, because that's the only way we can really preserve their memory. My right honourable friend has rightly alluded to the wonderful work of the Holocaust Educational Trust in allowing literally thousands of young people to visit Auschwitz-Birkenau and see for themselves at first hand. Will he commit the government to continue funding the Holocaust Educational Trust so that many thousands more can see the horrors of the Holocaust?
I can certainly make that commitment. We've funded it with over £10 million since I became Prime Minister. As I said in answer to an earlier question, it does excellent work. I also think there's a real need now, as tragic Holocaust survivors are coming to the end of their lives. Many of them are now speaking up in the most moving and powerful way. I will be spending some time today with some of them. Recording their testimonies, which must be part of our memorial, is absolutely vital, because their description of what they went through and the friends and family that they lost is so powerful and so moving. We must capture it for generations to come.
Sue Hayman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2013, the Energy and Climate Change Select Committee recommended extending the retention of business rates to include new-build nuclear power stations. The Centre for Nuclear Excellence is in my constituency, and the new build at Moorside is vital for our economic prosperity. Given the government cuts to Cumbria's councils, does the Prime Minister agree that if we are to truly build a northern powerhouse, our local authorities must retain all business rates from the nuclear new build in West Cumbria?
Well, I look very carefully at what the Honourable Lady says. We are committed to the new nuclear industry. We're obviously making good progress with Hinkley Point, but we need to see another big station go ahead. I look very carefully at what she says about business rate retention and business rates more. But the most important thing is to have an energy infrastructure that allows for the delivery of new nuclear power stations. That is the position on this side of the House.
Closed question, Mr. Martin Vickers.
Number 11, Mr. Speaker.
This government is absolutely committed to regenerating our coastal towns and ensuring that everyone, regardless of where they live in this country, has access to high-quality public services and to the very best opportunities, and I'm happy to reaffirm that to the House today.
On this question, Mr. Ian Paisley. I beg your pardon. I do beg your pardon. We must hear Mr. Vickers first. The honourable gentleman. Let's hear him.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his reply, and I recognise the initiatives that the government have taken. But he will know that many coastal towns, such as Cleethorpes, do suffer from poor educational standards. We have many high-performing academies who are trying to reverse that and ensure that our young people have access to sport, arts and culture at the highest level. Council are currently preparing a report with the private sector. Will he commit the government to work with me and the council to deliver regeneration to Cleethorpes?
Certainly no one, Mr. Speaker, could silence the voice of the humble. That was not going to happen. I think my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I'm happy to look at that proposal with him. I think the issue we've got is that we have to make sure we tackle both failing schools but also coasting schools, and there are some actually in coastal areas of our country. One of the issues is making sure that we get very talented teachers and very talented leaders into those schools, and that's what the National Leaders of Education Service is all about. But I'm happy to talk further with him.
Mr. Ian Paisley.
Deja vu. Rathlin Island is the only inhabited coastal village town in my constituency. No British Prime Minister has ever had the honour to visit that part of Ulster. And I wonder when the Prime Minister plans to visit this remote location, which has considerable economic needs and could generate more employment and tourism.
I'm the first British Prime Minister to many parts of our country. First to go to Shetland for about 30 years, but I fear if I went to this island, there might be a number of people who'd like me to stay there. But I will certainly bear it in mind the next time I visit the province.
Pawsey.
Speaker, Rugby is the fastest growing town in the West Midlands, with work underway to provide 6,200 much needed new homes at the Rugby radio site. But my constituents are keen to ensure that public services keep pace with those developments, and particularly to see more services at their local hospital, St Cross. Does the Prime Minister agree with NHS Chief Executive Sir Simon Stevens that district hospitals such as St Cross play an excellent role in the NHS?
No, I'm a believer in district general hospitals, and I know what a strong supporter of St Cross he is, and I know there's a new dedicated children's outpatient facility there, which is welcome. What I'd say to my honourable friend and to all honourable members across the House, if we're going to achieve these very aggressive house-building targets that we put forward, there will be more houses built in most of our constituencies, and it's important that we try as far make sure the infrastructure that goes with these necessary houses is provided.
Caroline Flint.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not everybody is as satisfied as the Chancellor with what for Google is loose change to cover their tax liabilities.
That's right.
On Monday, the Honourable Member for Amber Valley called on the government to make companies publish their tax returns. In that way, we can all see how they make the journey from their cash profit to their tax bill. Does the Prime Minister agree?
I do want to wonder whether the Right Honourable Lady ever raised this issue when she sat in the Labour cabinet when Google were paying zero tax. What we have is a situation where we make the rules in this House and where HMRC have to enforce those rules. That's the system that we need to make work.
Chris Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As cancer survival rates continue to improve, and given that this is Cancer Talk Week, will my right join me in welcoming a new state-of-the-art cancer information centre due to open at Royal Bolton Hospital, and praise the collaboration of Macmillan Cancer Care, Bolton PAC, Bolton Hospice, Bolton CCG, who are all making this happen.
Well, I'm very happy to join my honourable friend. Look, everyone in this House knows someone or knows a family member who's been touched by cancer, and many people have lost loved ones to cancer. The good news is that cancer survival rates are improving. We need to make sure they improve across all of the cancers, not just the best-known ones. But I think what he says is that this is not just an issue for the NHS, it's all of those big society bodies that also want to campaign and act on helping cancer sufferers that have such a big role to play.
Rue Hendry.
In the summer of 2014, as then leader of Highland Council, I wrote to the Prime Minister asking him to join the Scottish Government and Highland Council in taking forward a city deal for Inverness. Highland Council have submitted a detailed plan on the theme A Region for Young People. Will the Prime Minister now commit to giving this the green light in the coming weeks?
We are committed to examining the city deal with Inverness, just as we've made very good progress on the city deal with Aberdeen. And I think these bring together the best of what the Scottish Government can put on the table, but also the best of what the UK Government can put on the table, because without wanting to be too political about it, the two governments working together can do even more.
John Glenn.
Speaker, could I thank the Prime Minister for meeting the deposed Maldivian President Nasheed and his legal team in Number 10 on Saturday. Will the Prime Minister commit to work towards an international consensus on targeted sanctions so that the Maldivian regime may reconsider their appalling human rights record and their record on democracy?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this. It was an honour to meet with former President Nasheed, who I think did an excellent job for his country in cutting out corruption and turning that important country round. He suffered terribly by being in prison, and it's good that he's able to get out to seek medical treatment. But we want to see a change in behaviour from the Maldivian government to make sure are set free, and yes, we are prepared to consider targeted action against individuals if further progress isn't made. Let us hope that the diplomatic efforts, including by the Commonwealth Action Group, will lead to the changes we want to see, but Britain and our allies, including Sri Lanka and India, are watching the situation very closely.
Judith Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 46% of 5-year-old children in Bradford suffer from dental decay, compared with just 28% across England, and less than half of the children living in the Bradford district have seen a dentist in the last 2 years. Given the costs of treating tooth decay far exceed the costs of prevention, would the Prime Minister look at the lack of availability of NHS dentists in Bradford South as a matter of urgency?
I'm very happy to look at what the Honourable Lady says. If you take a view across the country, before 2010 we had those huge queues round the block when a new NHS dentist turned up because there weren't enough of them, and we've seen a very big... They may nod their heads, shake their heads, but that is what happened. Some of us can remember that, and we've seen NHS dentistry, but I'll look very carefully at the situation in Bradford.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend knows, the Peninsula Rail Task Force is set to deliver its report on a resilient railway to Devon and Cornwall. Would my right honourable friend be willing to meet with me and a number of colleagues to ensure that Network Rail and the Task Force has enough funding for the 2 studies into electrification of the line and the reduction in journey times necessary to do this?
Well, I had an excellent meeting with the South West Peninsula Rail Task Force, who've been working very closely with the government, and I'll make sure that we're continuing to liaise closely with them. Clearly, we need to find an answer to this, and we need to find the funding to make it work. We can't have what happened in the past, where a problem on our railways led to the peninsula being cut off. We can't see that happen again.
Siobhan McDonough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Prime Minister join me in congratulating my constituents, Dominic and Rebecca from Mitcham, on the birth of their daughter, Alice? Like every parent, they want their daughter to have better opportunities than they had. But with average London house prices increasing by £40,000 in 2000, and the average house in London now being worth over £500,000, does he understand their fears that Alice will never have the chance they had to buy her own home in the area she was born in?
Well, I want to help Alice and many like her in London get on the housing ladder, which is why we're introducing shared ownership, which brings housing in reach of many more people. It's why we've got Help to Buy London, which is twice as generous as in the rest of the country. It's why we're selling off the most expensive council houses and rebuilding more affordable homes. All of those things under the guidance and drive of Zach Goldsmith, who make an excellent mayor of London. That is Alice's best chance of a home, to have a Conservative mayor and a Conservative government working together hand in glove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Someone experiencing a mental health crisis who goes in desperation to A&E needs prompt specialist help. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's recognition of psychiatric liaison in his recent speech on life chances? And does he agree with me that 24/7 psychiatric liaison in A&E is an important step towards parity of esteem for mental health in a 7-day NHS?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. We are seeing more mental health and psychiatric liaison in our A&Es. We're seeing it in some. We need over time to see it in all, because so often we've got people arriving not in the right setting where they should be being looked after. So whether it's getting people with mental health conditions out of police cells, or making sure they're treated properly in prisons, or crucially when they arrive at A&E, making sure they get this treatment is very much part of our Life Chances plan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister for his remarks about Holocaust Memorial Day? In honouring the memory of those murdered by the Nazis, we provide the best antidote to extremism and anti-Semitism in our own age. The biggest challenge facing Europe today is the predicted 3 million refugees who will flee into our continent in 2016, many of whom will die along the way. Does he agree with me that the only way to challenge a crisis of that magnitude is by starting working with our European colleagues at the heart of a united Europe? And will he take this final opportunity to welcome in and provide a home for the 3,000 unaccompanied children as recommended by Save the Children?
What I'd say, where I agree with the right honourable gentleman, is the importance of taking action to help with this refugee crisis. And no country in Europe has been more generous in Britain in funding refugee camps, whether they are in Syria, whether they're in Turkey, whether they're in Lebanon, or whether they're in Jordan. Where I don't agree with the right honourable gentleman is thinking that the right answer is for Britain to opt in to the EU relocation and resettlement schemes. And let me tell him as for why. We said we would resettle 20,000 people in our country. We promised 1,000 by Christmas. And because of the hard work of my honourable friend, the honourable member for Watford, we achieved that. Now, if you add up all that Europe has done under its relocation scheme and its resettlement schemes, of all 27 other member states, they have done less than we've done here in the UK because of that 1,000. So yes, We should take part in European schemes when it's in our interest, help to secure the external European border, but we are out of Schengen, we keep borders, and under this government that's the way it'll stay.
Prime Minister's questions comes to an end there with a question from Tim Farron, the Lib Dem leader, on the migrants issue, which had come up earlier when the Prime Minister referred to those in the Calais campus, a bunch of migrants. We may come back to the use of that phrase in a minute. As expected, the Leader of the Opposition went on the Google tax settlement, which has been making the news over the past, 48 hours now. Probably make that 72, because it'll make the news tomorrow as well. Jeremy Corbyn just raising the question as well, has the HMRC really raised enough, as much as it could have done, over a tax settlement that goes back to 2005 with a country that generates billions of pounds every year? The Prime Minister retorting that it had not paid any tax under Labour, and that I guess the general line of the government is 130 million is better than nothing, and it went back and forward a little bit like that. Let's hear from our experts in a minute, but first of all let's hear how you reacted to PMQ's Joko.
Yes, well, the Google tax settlement angered many of our viewers, unsurprisingly. Thomas McNally says, can I pay 3% tax like Google on my earnings? Hayden Richards says, love it, 10 minutes in and Cameron is losing his bag. Also, I'm one of the ones who'd like to pay the same rate of tax as Google. Thanks for the great show, by the way. Martin Bristow, Labour and Corbyn are returning to the spite and envy agenda. Cameron reading out the litany of prominent Labour figures was powerful stuff. The Prime Minister handled this attack with ease. This from John Glenn, it is becoming pitiable. I actually feel sorry for Jeremy Corbyn. Cameron savages him most weeks and makes him look weak and ill-suited to the role. Maldwyn Dobbs says Mr Cameron jumping on this question of Google to try to equate Google in 2009 and Google today shows just how bad he is at fairness. And there was some fury from MPs in the House of Commons on the Prime Minister's use of the phrase bunch of migrants. Chuka Umunna, the Labour MP, tweeted saying it's inflammatory and unbecoming of his office, shameful. Diane Abbott, another Labour MP, says it was callous. Was that appropriate language, Ed Vaizey?
Well, look, we often have debates about the language used either by the Prime Minister or indeed other prominent politicians, particularly in the cauldron of the House of Commons, which you know well, PMQs, you're under a lot of pressure, 400 MPs baying at you, and I often find it's an excuse for not actually debating what the real issue is, and the real issue is, should we allow people who are camped in Calais simply to come to this country? And I think the Prime Minister, in terms of the immigration policy, is getting it absolutely right. He's going to the camps in Syria, he's helping there. As you know, we've got a huge overseas aid budget as well, helping Syrian refugees.
But was it regrettable language?
Look, we always talk about language. People will have their views. The Prime Minister was making the point that he doesn't agree with Jeremy Corbyn, that the people camped in Calais should come to this country, be given a free pass.
Does that include unaccompanied children now? Because there was talk at the weekend that the government may agree to some unaccompanied children coming in.
Yeah, I've seen that talk, and I gather it is an issue that is being considered. I don't know when a conclusion we reached about that. And again, there are a range of different issues you have to take into account, the kind of law of unintended consequences, if you like. But it's certainly an issue that the government wants to look at and see what it can do to help.
It's hard. I can see in some way where the Google story goes now, because Apple, Facebook, Amazon are in the line for the same sort of treatment as well. And I guess HMRC will come under pressure to be a bit tougher with those that are still outstanding. But given HMRC is bound not to release the details of how it's calculated the 130 million, I'm not exactly sure where this story goes next.
In terms of new events and actually consequences of all the sort of political anger, it's not clear either. But I think what Jeremy Corbyn did, a spikier Jeremy Corbyn today, I think what he will succeed in doing is keeping this going for another 24 hours, keeping this in the public eye. This is something that really winds up members of the public. There's no question about that. But at the same time, David Cameron was very well prepped for that attack. It was almost inevitable he was going to go on that. Reading out this list of senior members of the former Labour government who are now working for financial firms, of course, was designed to embarrass Jeremy Corbyn on this, with the attack that Labour didn't do anything about this either. But I think it is the kind of issue where Labour think they can make some ground just by keeping the story going and appearing that they're on the side of the ordinary person who looks at this and thinks, hang on a minute, this isn't fair.
Because the government needs all the money it can get. So, I mean, there was a kind of implication that the government was too close to Google, and there's certainly a lot of personal contact. But it may be a bit of a stretch to think that the closeness has resulted in a lower tax bill than they otherwise would have had.
Jeremy Corbyn was sort of almost suggesting there, by talking about ministerial contacts between the firms, that there was some kind of interference. Now, I agree with you. I think that's a bit of a stretch.
It'd be a great story if it was true.
It would be a great story if it was true, but I think that's a bit of a stretch. But I think when we look at the sort of life cycle of this story, this was perhaps the mistake, was by claiming this as a victory. George Osborne, on his Twitter feed and then various briefings to the papers over the weekend, he put himself in this story, asked for the credit, and then it turns out not to have been such a triumph after all in the public mind. And then he's left in a slightly position. You can't, or it's difficult politically to claim credit for something, and then when it doesn't turn out to be such a triumph, say, well, actually, it was nothing to do with me.
Did Number 10 distance themselves?
Look, I think after the coverage over the weekend, Number 10 we're not going to go on the record and say, of course, yes, this was a completely marvellous success. I think, as ever, these things are sometimes overdone. Shall I say they were slightly more
If
careful
Mr
with their
Osborne
language.
hadn't tweeted it out, he wouldn't have politicised it in the same way, would he?
I think there still would have been a bit of a rumpus.
Oh, yes.
But not in the same way.
Yvette Cooper, as we speak, has raised as a point of order the Prime Minister's remark, bunch of migrants. I thought it was surprising that the Prime Minister used, I think he was in full flow and probably a bit angry by this time, and sometimes you say things you don't mean to, but having just announced the Holocaust Memorial, to then talk about a bunch of migrants, I think maybe particularly jarred. I was also surprised, not just by the Prime Minister using it, but by Jeremy Corbyn not just taking a segue to react to that, given that Mr Corbyn had been in the camps and called for unaccompanied children, for Britain to be more generous. Did he miss an opportunity there?
I was shocked when I heard the Prime Minister say it. It was offensive, it was hurtful, it was divisive. It's not the first time we've heard David Cameron slip up in this way, and I would have thought, I appreciate what you say about the heat of the moment, but this kind of language, when you're the Prime Minister, it is so important to get it right. Jeremy too is under pressure in the heat of the moment and Prime Minister's questions, and a lot in his mind about how he manages his time. But I think we were all really taken aback, actually, and silenced by what the Prime Minister said.
Except that Mr Corbyn had been there.
Yeah.
He had seen the state of that camp, which I understand is appalling. The Prime Minister hasn't been there. And there is this issue we're talking about with Ed Vaizey a minute ago as to whether we should not be more generous in our treatment of unaccompanied children, some of whom would be in that camp.
I think we should be speaking out really clearly from a moral position about our obligation to those very, very vulnerable children at every opportunity. And I think that what Jeremy saw in the camps will have absolutely brought home to him the horror of what those people fleeing persecution are going through. So I think we should be looking for opportunities across all parties, both to use the right language, but to develop the policies that will bring these children to safety as quickly as possible.
As this goes on, though, Laura, the run-up to the referendum, indeed even the negotiation and up to the February summit and then beyond, the backdrop of developing events in Europe could be horrendous, and particularly horrendous for those who want this country to stay in Europe.
Indeed, and there's no question that is very much on ministers' minds, and that is part of the reason for what is urgency about trying to get this deal done in February, partly because the expectation is that in the coming months and then of course through the summer, the huge volumes of people and the distress that we see night after night on our television screens is not going to get any better, and in fact it may get even worse. And I think politically, of course, the situation is so much more acute now. Now also we see the kind of chaos but also sort of suffering in European capitals. You know, this is no longer what we see, a question about people sort of moving at the edges of Europe. This is, indeed, this is now places where the British voters are sort of familiar with and might have been on holiday. Now, that might sound a sort of crass thing to say, but this is absolutely part of the calculation that ministers are very well aware of, the broader canvas of what's going on in the world when we actually choose whether or not to stay or leave the EU, will in a lot of people's minds actually be much more significant of what the campaigns themselves can actually influence.
Right, we'll leave it there. Laura, thank you.
Now, how old should you be before you're allowed to stick an X on a ballot paper and stick it in a box? Well, like the UK, most people around the world are allowed to vote at the age of 18. Some buck the trend and opt for 21, like in the Cameroon, for example. Others, like Austria, have recently lowered the age you can vote to 16. Some people want to do the same here. But should we, in fact, be raising it instead? Here's political journalist Samuel Hooper with this week's Soapbox.
Going to university used to signify growing up, leaving the family nest and taking your first steps as an adult. But for a growing number of today's students, this isn't the case. Many of today's students want to turn university campuses and students' union into safe spaces where dissenting and controversial ideas are banned and free speech is suspended for their mental safety. Student activists have taken to banning clapping in meetings, claiming that it triggers anxiety. And some are now even demanding the airbrushing or rewriting of history to remove any reference to controversial figures from the past, like Cecil Rhodes. Students here in the Oxford Union voted last week to remove his statue from Oriel College. But if students want to be treated like emotionally fragile children, do they not forfeit the right to have a say in the running of our country? We don't let children drink, smoke or drive. Do we really want them to vote? Ironically, there's currently a push to lower the voting age in the UK, giving 16 and 17-year-olds the right to take part in the coming EU referendum. But since this generation of students feel harmed by hearing dissenting opinions or the mere act of public debate, rather than talking about lowering the voting age, shouldn't we consider raising it instead?
And Samuel Hooper joins us now, and I'm assured that you are over the age of 25 at least.
Just about, yes.
What age would you raise the voting age to?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I'm not the only one who's brought this up, actually. After a number of high-profile incidents on campuses in America, the respected American law professor and blogger Glenn Reynolds actually suggested raising the age to 25, and that was after we saw Yale students go absolutely berserk over a flash-in-the-pan drama about Halloween costumes, and we saw the University of Missouri actually drum their university chancellor out of his job, and then still demand that he go and apologise to them and apologise for his white male privilege for really having done nothing at all, if you actually dig into the case.
Does that behaviour really justify a campaign or a call to raise the voting age?
Well, if you look into what all of this, the background of these demands for trigger warnings and safe spaces are, it's students saying that they feel emotionally fragile, that encountering an opinion or a statue, as we saw in Oxford, or anything else that goes against their views is akin to being physically punched in the face. They take it very much as though they're incurring emotional harm, and I'm simply saying that, well, if that's what you really believe, if you feel that you're incurring emotional harm from hearing contrary views, maybe wait a few years until you enter the rough world of politics.
But that's a sweeping, I mean, it is a sweeping statement, if you don't mind me saying that, you know, heavy punishment on all young people of 18 to 25, denying them the right to vote because of a handful of student unions behaving illiberally, in your mind.
No, it's interesting, because I watched some of the youth parliament earlier on, and you saw some of the brightest 16 and 17-year-olds you'll ever see in Parliament in Westminster debating. But then something seems to happen when you hit the age of 18 and go to university for a few years. I don't know why it is. Well, something goes a bit crazy, and then we say it's only a few students, but we take our lead from America, and this problem in the United States is becoming a lot bigger.
Right.
As I say, people's careers are ending over it. People's curriculums are being limited. People's knowledge is being constrained by these draconian laws.
I mean, you were there inside the Oxford Union. I mean, they make a point of inviting controversial speakers and have done over the decades, from Nick Griffin, Marine Le Pen, O.J. Simpson, which I suggest to you is actually encouraging free debate, and you were there. Let's put the point to Ed Vaizey, who was laughing there at what happens to you when you turn to the age of 18. Do you think people are responsible enough, even at the age of 18?
Oh, yes, definitely. No, I was only laughing at this. What the thesis seemed to be developing, that given what your experience in the youth parliament, that you could have the vote from 16 to 18, then you would lose the vote and get it back at 25. So, no, I think people are responsible at 18, and we all go, Kate and I go, obviously, to our secondary schools and talk to sixth formers. Some are 18, some are 17, some are 16 or
Would you go
younger,
up to 16?
and they're extremely articulate. I wouldn't go to 16, but I totally understand people who campaign for it, and it's an interesting, I don't think it's a ridiculous suggestion. I'm happy with the status quo. I think 18 is right, but as I say, you meet a lot of articulate and intelligent people younger than that who are very engaged in politics. Just you meet people who are older who aren't.
Let me just put it to Kate Green, because there have been these examples of illiberal activity depriving students of free speech. Trying to stop Germaine Greer, for example, coming to Cardiff University because of her views on transgender people, and the debate over the Cecil Rhodes statue. I mean, is this an indication that actually there is a lack of maturity amongst students, that they are actually now trying to clamp down on free speech?
I don't think it's a new thing. I think there have always been controversies in our university who will be invited and given a platform. And I think it is part of exploring boundaries and debating ideas and issues. Of course, we shouldn't forget that the government too is effectively clamping down on free speech in universities with some of its counter-extremism proposals. So I don't think this is an age-related matter. I think it's simply a matter of getting the balance right.
Samuel, thank you very much. We've run out of time, but thank you.
Now, how do you like to spend your annual holidays? Are you like our Kate here, who enjoys sipping sangria by the pool with her pals? Or like Ed, more of an opera in Tuscany sort of guy, befitting his job? Or would you rather spend your holidays somewhere like this?
Get your passport and your bikini. You need a holiday. Come see me. I know you're tired of the same old scenery, and I could change all that so easily. Go out, but I think you'll take a chance. I'll take you to the south of France like Cannes. If anybody can, I can. Or we could go shopping.
And they should have never, ever, ever been in the country. And, folks, we have to get smart.
Stop my persistence. So let's ride out.
And that means saying no to Donald Trump.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
I want to move you up. I want to take you away. So have a word, darling. What do you say? If you ain't doing nothing, let's fly away. Drive away. Get away. We could go to the club or hide away. We could do what you want to, baby. If you ain't doing nothing, let's fly away. Drive away. Take a holiday. We can go to the club or hide away. We could do what you want to, baby. Do what you want to, baby.
Well, one travel company's raised eyebrows by offering a £2,370 package holiday to the European Parliament ahead of the EU referendum. And that's not all. They offer holidays to North Korea, Palestine, Iran, and the US in November. Well, that's when the election is, of course, the presidential election. The travellers will spend their time not relaxing on the beach, but instead having meetings with politicians, bureaucrats. Nicholas Wood, Director of Political Tours, joins me now. Exactly why would I pay £2,500 to hang out in Brussels?
Good question. One could ask why people watch this programme. It's the same kind of people who come on our tours who are sitting here watching you.
That bad?
It is that bad.
We don't charge them £2,000. It's true.
Judging by the Twitter feed, it's going to be
Did this programme give you an idea? Give you the idea?
No, I used to be a journalist, and I had family who'd come and visit me in the Balkans, funny enough, and they found it fascinating, and that's where the idea came from.
So what would an average night out in Brussels be on this trip?
Well, it's 5 days long, that's all, and basically
5 days for £2,500. That's 500 quid a day.
There are some people who enjoy opera
Get to
and
Thailand
beaches.
for that.
There are some people who enjoy opera and beaches, and there are other people who are more interested in how the world ticks. And what we try and do is provide them with it's almost like having your own personal foreign correspondent. And so you can go and get access to places that you might not ordinarily, and see and get access to different lives and get analysis, and ask the questions yourself. So it's
Andrew wants to go, so put his name down.
Here you go.
Joko wants to go to North Korea. Could you arrange for that? Probably for no more than 6 months.
I got you a present from Cuba as well, where we're just back from.
Excellent. Well, we can be bought.
Where's mine? Partagas.
Partagas.
I didn't know you smoked.
It was worth anything else. I mean, we can be bought.
Do you pay extra not to see a European Parliament debate?
No, you don't.
Can you imagine?
How many people go on these trips?
How many people? We get the the tours are quite small because you can't take a
I bet
bus.
they are.
No, you can't take a bus load of people. Basically, what you're trying to do is replicate what journalists do. So we take small groups between about 6 and 10 people, and you get access to people involved, actively in politics. You have senior correspondents working with you, and it really brings the news to life for you.
There's more of a seminar on tour.
It's called Political Tours.
Indeed.
The clue's in the name.
Thank you for explaining it to me.
But other package tours and other cigars are available. Time to put you... Well, Monte Cristo,
You're right.
Romeo and Juliet. Just time to find out of your misery. Give you the answer to guess the year. It was 2009. Please,
Kate,
one of you press
the buzzer.
press that button. Well done.
That was done tentatively.
Just launched a cruise missile.
Caroline, you've just won a political tour.
Well done. You won a political tour to North Korea, as well as a mug. The 1 o'clock news is starting over on BBC One. I'll be here at noon tomorrow with all the usual political stories of the day. Hope you can join me then. Bye-bye.